Hey everyone, my name is Blaine Cameron, for those of you who may not know, and I am a session member here at Knox, as well as I sit on the Finance Committee. And today, similar to prior years at our annual general meetings, I'd like to actually spend a couple of minutes here on video just to go through our financial results for 2023. And after the formal part of the meeting, certainly in person, I'm happy to address any questions or concerns on any of my comments or any of the information that may be shared with you on the screen. But look, before we get too far into this thing, for those of you who may have already looked at the annual report in paper format or on PDF format, there's 30 pages in that report, and I think of the 30, 15 are actually dedicated to financial information. So I don't know if you're like me, but that stuff can be quite overwhelming and tough to kind of manage or kind of work yourself through. And so before we get into too much of the detail, I just wanted to pause, step back and sort of level set in terms of how our finances are organized here at Knox. And today I actually have a number of jars in front of me. There's 8 jars, and each one of these jars really are intended to represent an account or a fund that we have. And so the first one I've got in my hand here is a missions fund. And the missions fund is a fairly significant amount of investment dollars managed with National Bank Financial. And the mission committees oversees this money to basically go out into the community, whether it's here in Waterdown or beyond, to fund missional type projects. There's a minister's discretionary fund. And what this fund is, this is an amount of money that Grant is able to go out, buy some coffee for people, perhaps buy some books for individuals. Really, it's at his discretion to spend however he wants to spend. There's a benevolence fund. The benevolence fund is an amount of money where the benevolence committee has authority to help folks that just need some extra financial need, whether it's pay rent, buy groceries, whatever. No receipts, no questions asked. Really, it's an opportunity for us, again, to serve our community and serve our fellow people in need. And the fourth fund I'm going to talk about is there's an education endowment fund. What this fund is, it's an amount of money that one of our former congregants had set aside so that whenever kids are coming up through the church, they graduate from high school to go on to post-secondary education, they can receive a distribution from this cash or for this fund to help them with their further studies. So we do try to keep all of those jars or all those funds sort of separate where they do self-sustain. There's 4 jars, though, here in particular I'd like to spend a little bit more time on this morning. The first jar I'm going to talk about is a Manse Fund. And what the Manse Fund is, this is a specific account at National Bank Financial where when the church years ago had a manse for its minister and the manse was sold, the proceeds from that sale went into this account. And the investment income from this account can be used to supplement our minister's housing allowance. So as that minister has personal needs for utilities or taxes, that's part of their compensation package where Knox would take certain amounts of money out of this fund to fund those dollars. The next one is a manager's reserve fund. That reserve fund is really intended to have a pool of capital available to the facilities committee to help with repairs and maintenance. So for example, a couple years ago, we needed a new fridge. Or this coming year, I think we're going to probably need a new air conditioner or furnace. And so those kind of monies would come out of that manager's reserve fund. The next fund is an enduring capital fund. This fund has a lot of money in it. And this is the fund where when Aldershot years ago was sold, the proceeds from that property went into this fund. There's over $1 million in this fund. The monies earned on this fund are really intended to help us as a church, as a congregation, grow, be missional, go out into our community. There's a lot of latitude in terms of how we spend these dollars, but this is a significant asset, and we're incredibly blessed to have these funds available to further the kingdom of God. And then the last thing, I think, is something we can all get behind. This is our general fund, and this is essentially our checking account. Every week, our offerings go into the fund, and every week, whether it's utilities, whether it's internet costs, whether it's salaries, whether it's repairs, any other kind of stationary costs come out of this thing. What we have found over the last couple years is the offerings coming into this general fund have not been sufficient to actually fund all the expenses going out. And so what we've actually had to do is use some of the Manse Fund, some of the Manager's Reserve Fund, and some of the Enduring Capital Fund to kind of top up the general fund so we're never in kind of an overdraft position. So these are kind of the 4 jars I really want to focus on this morning. And with that, it's probably not a bad time to maybe jump into some of the slides I've put together just to kind of guide the conversation as we move forward over the next couple of moments. So the first slide, look, it's going to be focused on that general fund that I was talking about. So in 2023, offerings that came into the church were $223,300. That's what, as a congregation and as guests of our congregation, brought into the church. And that actually was less than last year, but it was over budget. You may recall last year when we were in our annual meeting, based on trend lines, we thought, or we suggested, or we budgeted our 2023 receipts would be less than 2022, which in fact they were, but the 2023 receipts were actually more than what we planned, more than what we budgeted. So you can see they were actually $6,800 more than what we budgeted. So thank you all to make that happen. They were under last year by 2022, I should say, by $7,400. But again, I think that's a starting place to say the offerings coming in were $223,000. On the expense side of the house, the expenses were $315,000. So obviously, expenses more than the income, but the expenses were less than what was budgeted. Again, last year we talked about increasing costs through inflation. We talked about some new investment in a youth minister. So we knew our expenses were going to be higher. They weren't as actually high as what we suggested. In fact, they came in $3,700 less than budget, but they were $20,500 more than 2022. So when you put those things together, you put the income and the expenses together, we had a net loss of $91,700 in 2023. That again was less than we were projecting. It was less by $10,500, but it certainly was over 2022 because we made more investment in 2023. Maybe we can sort of dig in to sort of say, well, okay, we had this $91,000 loss. How was it funded? So again, it comes back to these other jars. And so on this slide, I've identified exactly how much money is in each one of these jars. And so the Manse Fund started 2023 with a balance of $151,000. Between interest and dividends and gains, there was $13,500 earned on the investment portfolio. We took $9,000 out of the jar to fund, again, the minister's housing allowance. So at the end of the year, there was $156,200 in this jar. On the Manager's Reserve Fund, that fund has a lesser amount of money. It's started the year $12,000. It earned $500 of interest. The closing balance was $12,500. We didn't take anything out of this jar in 2023. And the last fund, the big one, it started the year at $1,027,700. The gains in this thing were $92,000. The stock market, it was a little bit blippy, but it held up well. There was about $50,000 of dividends and interest, and then we had some capital gains in there. So it grew by $92,000, but we took $95,000 out of this account to help us fund the $91,000 loss. And so it ended the year at $1,024,000 left in this jar. So what you'll see here on the slide is in our general fund, this is kind of like a game of going through the various jars here, but in the general fund, we had a deficit of $91,000, but we topped it up by $104,000 through these other funds. And so I'm hoping that provides a little bit of clarity in terms of how does this cash flow work when we're operating on sort of a general deficit. Diving a little deeper maybe in terms of the income and the expenses, obviously, our offertory givings is a significant piece of the income earned by the church. As I said, in 2023, Finance Committee in session and the congregation as a whole approved a budget where we knew our offertory givings were going to come down. This is, I think, a reflection of coming out of COVID, and there's been some changes in our congregation. So what we saw was our envelope holders actually decreased by 3% givings, and the PAR participants, the PAR donations decreased by 8%. And so the total decrease in the envelope givings were $10,700 from 2022. On the rental side, though, that's a good news story in the fact that there was $4,700 more rent earned from the facilities, so that offset some of that reduction in the offertory givings. And then we also saw the immemorial donations decrease from 2022. So I think when you kind of look at all those various components, that explains kind of on a net basis, our revenue dropped from 2022 to 2023 by $7,400. I did want to call a special shout out, if you will, on Presbyterian Sharing, because I think sometimes Presbyterian Sharing maybe gets lost or forgotten about. Presbyterian Sharing obviously is a contribution to our national church, right? It's amount we contribute to fund national programs, national discipleship, national missions that are really promoted and led by Presbyterian Church in Canada. And so we had donated in 2023, $26,600. It was a little bit less than what we had planned, but it was certainly $900 more than 2022. On the expense side of the house, again, spending a little bit more detail and a little bit more granularity in terms of what do those expenses really look like. We did see staff expenses increase significantly from 2022, and that was because we hired a youth minister, right? We also had extra costs associated with that role. We had inflationary adjustments come through, and so that is a staff expense. The educational costs, they went up by $4,400, again with a focus on getting people back in person, small groups, youth ministry. And our church building, though, we actually had a savings year over year. There weren't the same number of repairs and maintenance required. So our repairs and maintenance expenses and church expenses went down by $5,500. And I think actually a big piece of that was, you may know, Peter Matter, he's been helping out on the landscaping. And so we haven't had to have any summer landscaping costs. That was a big savings right there. As well as in 2022, we had some repairs to the sound system that we didn't have in 2023. I guess with that, that's 2023 in the rearview mirror. That's really kind of where we landed. I think certainly I would like to thank the congregation for the support. We had a strong year in terms of we exceeded our budgeted amounts. I think as we move into 2024, it's important to understand where we've come from and again, where we need to go. Over the past 8 years, we've actually budgeted these deficits. And so certainly, when I look at an 8-year sort of period, we've kind of been in the range of an $80,000 to $100,000 deficit. You may recall that this general fund, this in and of itself kicks off about $50,000 of interest and dividends. So, we've got $50,000 before we start eroding any of this capital. And so, again, whenever Finance Committee in session is reviewed, we do know that we are in a growth mode. We know we've been called by God to go out and be loud in our communities, in our Christian faith, and that does take money. And so there has been a concerted decision to drive a deficit and take some of the gifts that we have been given to fund that from a financial perspective. And so as we move into 2024, there's a projected loss of $107,000, $106,900 to be exact. But again, I think that there's been a lot of prayerful consideration going into how those numbers have been derived. And I think we feel strongly that in fact, it may not be, that's a worst case scenario. Whenever we look at that $107,000 loss, to get there, we are expecting or anticipating offering envelopes or offerings to go up. And so what I mean by that is we're expecting offerings in total to go up by $5,700 or about 5%. We are going to be more focused on renting our facilities, and so we're hoping that that will drive an extra $12,000 from rent. So our rental income will be $18,000 in total. And so between the additional offering givings and the additional rental, we're suggesting that we will get an increased revenue stream of $18,300 from 2023 to 2024. On the flip side, we know our costs are going up. And so you'll see on the right hand of this slide in front of you just kind of where those expenses are landing. And so our caretaking costs are increasing. As I mentioned earlier, we think we're going to need a new furnace and air conditioning unit. That's going to cost $7,000. Again, we want to encourage the family and youth ministry program. There's probably a little bit more money that's going to be required to be spent there. Our salary costs and our housing costs, they are increasing. Our supply costs are increasing. The computer and internet costs, I think we can all relate to those. They are increasing as well. So our total expenses are expected to increase by $33,500 from 23 to 24. So putting this all together, at the bottom of the page here, we're seeing an increase in receipts of $18,300 from additional offering, additional rent. We're seeing additional expenses of $33,500. So we're expecting our loss to increase by $15,200 from 2023 to 2024. And there's a bit of a reconciliation just on the very bottom right corner of that page that kind of says, okay, our 23 loss was $91,700. We think it's actually going to increase by $15,200, and that is how we are suggesting there will be a loss of $106,900. So I think the obvious question becomes, well, how are we going to pay for that loss? It does come back to these jars again. Seems like everything's coming back to the jars this morning, but really what we're suggesting is we've got these 3 jars that we can pull on. We're going to take $7,000 out of the manager's reserve fund to pay for the furnace. So that's coming out of this one. So we're really going to draw this account down fairly low. And then we're going to take $100,000 out of the Enduring Capital Fund. And as I said, the Enduring Capital Fund, interest and dividends is about $50,000 alone. We also think that the investment portfolio is very well positioned for an interest rate decrease to potentially pop up a little bit. And so we're suggesting between interest, dividends, and gains, there will be at least $65,000 of interest income, investment income realized. So we're looking at pulling on $100,000. So this fund, although it started on January 1 of $1,024,000, we're expecting this could actually be dropping down to $990,000 by the end of 2024. So look, that said and done, at the very bottom, even though we are in a deficit position, our closing balance of projected funds at December 31st, 2024 is still over $1 million. It's $1,162,000 whenever you kind of look at these 4 jars in culmination or tandem. And with that, I'm hoping that I've provided some clarity in terms of the financial information that's been disseminated through the annual report. But look, if you have any questions or concerns, don't be hesitant, don't be shy. I'm here in the congregation this morning, and I'm happy to address any questions or concerns you may have. And with that, Grant, I'm going to pass the mic back to you.